Welcome to the meeting of the White House Council for Community Solutions. As those of you here know, I am Patty Stonecipher, the chairperson. And now to begin our public meeting, I invite Susanna Washburn, our designated federal officer, to open the meeting up.
Thanks, Patty. We are now in session. Our meeting is being streamed live on the White House website where you can submit comments and questions. We won't be answering questions today, but we will periodically post responses to frequently asked questions. I now turn the meeting over to our chair, Patty.
We'll spend this 2 hours that we have for our public meeting on two purposes. The first is to, again, anchor ourselves in the work. And to do that, we're lucky to have John Kania, senior partner at FSG and the author of this fabulous article that you all have read on collective impact. And John will be with Paul Schmitz helping us bring forward his ideas and findings, and then we'll be open for conversation about the role of collective impact and how it might affect the work of the council. After that, we will move to the playback from our work groups. Our communications, effectiveness, and program work groups have begun to shape their sets of objectives and plans, and we want to have the whole council engage in discussion around that, and then we will figure out where we go from here as our last objective of the public meeting this afternoon. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. And for after lunch, we thought we should save this time for the most exciting conversation of the day because it is after lunch. And I think what John's going to talk about will be very exciting. I just wanted to give a little context, which the best way for me to kind of open it is to say that last spring I woke up to a terrible headline in my local newspaper that our city, Milwaukee, had the worst fourth grade reading scores for African American children in the country. And I thought for a moment, how could that be? In the 18 years I've worked here, I've seen dramatic increases in funding to youth programs, all these school reforms, charter schools, choice schools, dramatic growth of youth organizations, the professionalization certificate programs in youth development, nonprofit management, nonprofit MBAs, all of this effort, all of the resources and all the capacity, and all these groups are meeting all these outcomes. So I call my colleague at the Community Foundation, I said, are these groups meeting, they're all meeting their outcomes. Then how do we still have the worst results? And all these individual organizations are saying they're doing all this effective work, but we're not seeing the top line data change. And so I think in ways we've been following a social change model that's about building individual organizations, not building solutions. And I was very excited to read John's article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review because I've been following what's happening in Cincinnati and also in other cities. In my city, it was done with teen pregnancy, where the United Way pulled a bunch of organizations together, all the groups working on it. I made them collectively come up with an outcome and work toward it. And they've actually reduced the top-line data in the city. And I think that thinking about a solution versus thinking about an organization is a different framework than the nonprofit sector's often done. And so I just, without further ado, want to introduce John to talk about his work.
Great, thank you, Paul. Well, I must say that it's rather frightening to be the one who follows the First Lady. But it's actually pretty, I feel pretty lucky because now my kids will actually have something nice to say about me to their friends. It's an honor to be here and delight to be here. And we're really pleased that this council has found the work that we've done around collective impact to be useful. The genesis of the research was an effort by Mark Kramer and I to address the very simple question of how does one actually achieve large-scale change against complex social problems? Now, we have many initiatives out there in the social arena that have achieved progress against numbers of people. But large-scale change is really, really elusive. And that's true no matter whether or not you're talking education, the environment, poverty, healthcare, really any complex social issue that you look at out there. You're hard pressed to find examples of communities or initiatives that have actually achieved large-scale change. So setting out to look at that led us to identify this phenomenon that we talk about in the article of isolated impact. So much of the social sector is focused on working with individual organizations who are working in an isolated way. And they're great organizations. You know, we know there are a lot of terrific organizations out there, but they can't do it alone. And you know what? They know that too. Just remember that. It's really interesting to me to look at some of the, and I know a lot of the different winners of the Social Innovation Fund. They were identified as organizations, but these are also people who will tell you how important collaboration is to solving large-scale change. So what I thought I'd do is, well, it's exciting to sort of think about you know, how you can actually achieve collective impact. And that's really what we set out to do. And we identified just a handful of efforts out there, not a lot, that were achieving positive and consistent progress against the top line that Paul talks about. And so we said, what do these initiatives and efforts have in common? So I know you all read the article, got through your briefing pack, but I want to briefly summarize what those 5 are. And then I want to really try to maybe tee up what the implications of those 5 conditions for collective impact are against the issue that this council has chosen to focus on, youth pathways or whatever it actually becomes called. The first is that communities, initiatives that have been able to achieve collective impact focus on a common agenda. What I mean by that is there's a common definition of the problem, and the organizations that are involved have basically jointly agreed to an action plan that they're going to implement together. So common agenda is number 1. The second is a shared measurement system. If you look across these initiatives, they've been able to basically put in place a measurement system that not only sort of looks at things across the community, but also each of the organizations that are engaged actually measures themselves against that same set of indicators. It's a shared measurement system. The third thing is that the organizations that are engaged in collective impact initiatives are engaged in mutually reinforcing activities. What we mean by that is that they're not all doing the same things. They've figured out what they excel at, and then they reinforce each other in terms of actually getting the work done. So that's the third, mutually reinforcing activities. The fourth is continuous communication. You know, we looked at, in all the collective impact initiatives that we looked at, CEO level, or in the organizations at the CEO level, they were meeting on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. That sounds crazy, right? But that's what it takes. It takes that level of frequency that builds relationships and gets the trust so that people can actually say, okay, I might actually give up a little of what I'm doing because I see the bigger picture. It takes that level of continuous communication. And finally, in effective collective impact initiatives, there's a backbone organization. There's a backbone organization that's essentially the supporting infrastructure. They've performed the critical functions of basically providing some strategic coherence to what's going on and reminding people of that. And they serve the role of process facilitator for both meetings and for the initiative itself. And that's the organization that collects data and does the measurement. Now, in the initiatives that we looked at, both those that were successful and those that failed, probably the number one reason why a collaborative effort failed was because there was not a backbone organization, a neutral organization that had those capabilities that I just talked about in place. Now, one of the most germane examples of collective impact to the council's work, and we talked about it in the article, but I want to pause on it a minute and just reflect on it and what's going on there. Is this education initiative, Cradle to Career Education Initiative in Cincinnati. Paul mentioned it briefly, Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, called Strive. Now, Strive is a partnership of over 300 organizations. You've got universities, you got the public school system, you have faith-based organizations, you have corporations, you have foundations, you have nonprofits. They're all at the table. They're all part of this collaborative. And in 4 years, they've been able to move the top line and make progress against against a significant number of the indicators on student achievement they have set out. Now, it's an amazing initiative, and then you start to pull it apart and say, well, how's that happening? Well, these CEOs are meeting, on a regular basis. They're meeting bi-monthly or monthly, and they break it down. They say, okay, there's 5 key transition points for children and students as they move from kindergarten to 12th grade. And we need to know what those are. And then there's 22 intervention points in there. So they've got a roadmap. And they've sort of identified a roadmap that everybody in the community is on the same page with. And they've broken it down and said, okay, we're going to have 15 student success networks. What's a student success network? Well, early childhood. All the people that are involved in early childhood, from the public school systems to foundations who support early childhood to the corporations who support early childhood, nonprofits, they're all around that table trying to figure out, okay, what is our evidence-based approach in early childhood? And then you have the Access to College folks in a different student success network. So it's an amazing initiative, and actually, one thing I want to bring up is my personal introduction to this initiative. I was involved in a strategic planning process for a newly established $300 million foundation in Cincinnati 3 years ago. Strategic plan. We got to go in. We got to say, okay, what's this foundation going to focus on, and how are they going to have an impact? We went around. We talked to the United Way, the Community Foundation, private foundations, GE, Procter & Gamble, headquartered in Cincinnati. Everybody took out a book, opened up the playbook, and said, here's the map. Here's how we're doing things in Cincinnati. If your client, your funder, wants to participate in education, they've got to get on board with this. I mean, that's powerful. Yeah. And these funders went even further. They actually, many of them started saying, okay, we're going to align our funding and the indicators for success in education that we had, we're going to shift those to what Strive has. And they also said, okay, the nonprofits that we've been funding, unless you shift your initiatives or your indicators to that, we're not going to fund you. Talk about alignment. I mean, it was a powerful, powerful, powerful experience for me. Now, I mean, we talked a lot about some amazing organizations in this Youth Pathway space this morning, and there are some people, they're doing incredible work out there. And even Tanisha last night from Europe was just, totally inspiring. I was totally inspired by her. What I would suggest is I want you guys to get as inspired about Strive, maybe more inspired, because they're achieving large-scale change. And maybe, they don't have as sort of compelling a face because it's over 300 organizations, and that's sort of hard to get emotional about. But they're achieving large-scale change, which is what you're all here to do. So I'm going to ask you to get as excited about Strive and the other collaborative initiatives out there. I know it's hard. They don't have a face. But I want you to get as excited about them. If you care about large-scale change, you want to get as excited about those initiatives. You want this council to lift those up. So what I wanted to do is maybe shift a little bit and just a couple of comments about the implications of our work for Youth Pathways and the work that you're doing. First of all, I want to say that our sense, based on the work that we do in communities around the country, is that Youth Pathways is an area that's ripe for collective impact. It's absolutely ripe for collective impact. For starters, this work that you're doing actually spans 3 different systems: workforce development, economic development, and education. And these are 3 different siloed systems with different social norms and cultures, and there's an opportunity to bring them together. And we can talk more about that maybe when we get to Q&A. But I think basically this council can be the organization that helps connect the dots there. I think people are looking for that. The flip side is that within each of those systems, there is a lot of collaboration going on already, so there are relationships that exist that you can build off of. I think there's more demand for this work out there in communities by the people that are doing it this than maybe we think, based on what I know. I think people are ready for this. The second thing is I think there's a terrific opportunity for shared measurement. I mentioned earlier that this is a new way of thinking. You know, education metrics for success are pretty well known at this point in terms of K through 12 and higher education. But we're also talking metrics that you need to develop around career advancement and around social and financial stability. In Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about that. But it's, you know, it's an area that needs to be attended to. The one thing I'll say, and maybe we can talk more about it in the dialogue, when we talk about shared measurement systems, we published some research about a year and a half ago on what we call breakthroughs in shared measurement systems. There are some really powerful systems that are actually being used by thousands of organizations in community development and arts and culture that are actually, you know, people are able to put their data in, their data to collection tools that are provided, their low-cost web-based platforms that people can use, and we can talk more about that in Q&A, or you can read the research. The third thing I would say is that I think there's a real opportunity when we go back to mutually reinforcing activities for this council to help communities figure out how to do that. One example, we worked with a community of 90,000 people in the Northwest, and we did a survey of how many youth development organizations they had. They had 270 youth development organizations. There were 270 organizations that said they touch youth development. Now, you know, looking at that there's lots of duplication, there's still gaps, and that there's a lot of different ways of measuring success. They may be looking at different populations. So I think there's a way, and you know, we've done this in our work a bit, to actually help give communities tools to map out who are the players that are touching youth pathways. The final thing, I'll just wrap up with a final thought in terms of what this council might consider. You know, if you talk to the people in communities about the barriers to actually doing this and the barriers to collaborative work, one of the things that you'll hear is the misalignment of funding sources. Federal funding sources, state sources, and local. I mean, even if you look at federal, and somebody mentioned it earlier, over 300 sources of revenue here, and you can, if we borrow President Obama's analogy from the State of the Union in terms of, you know, if a salmon's caught offshore, it's the Department of Commerce. If it's caught in the freshwater, it's Department of Interior, and smoked salmon is something altogether different. This is exactly what's happening in youth pathways. And if you go out and you talk to people in communities and you say, what can we do that could actually help you guys? They'll say, actually help figure out, you know, study that misalignment, not only at the federal level, but maybe even with a couple of pilot examples, look at the state and the municipal level. Study that misalignment and see what you can do in terms of recommendations that would actually remove some of those barriers and use that funding more flexibly in a place-based way. So I know we're short on time, but I welcome your thoughts and comments.
Great. I just wanted to give two things. One is Cincinnati's graduation rate, high school graduation rate, has risen from 50 to 80% over the last decade. And there's some question about that overall. But using the same metrics other cities use, they have had a bump in their top line metric. And another thing is, just as an example, their deputy superintendent schools went to Strive and said there were 6 to 7 schools that had spikes in disciplinary problems and attendance. They pulled the Mentoring Student Success Network, which is about 15 organizations together. They created a joint action plan for those 6 or 7 schools. The funders put the funding behind that joint action plan, and all the mentoring programs in cities are focused on helping those schools right now. And I think that's just an example of how, when you have that collaborative effort, you're actually gearing all the resources toward the need. And so why don't we just open up for questions and see if anyone has any questions. Please move your things if you may.
John, I'd love to hear a little more about how to ensure accountability amongst all the various organizations that are working.
Just in the
Can you hear me?
Yes, speak up.
radiators have kicked on.
Sorry, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you ensure accountability amongst all the various players, a little more on that topic, because it could get, obviously, it gets very complex, and making sure that you're staying on track.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, how to ensure accountability. You know, if you look at an initiative like Strive, again, you set up sort of what are the indicators, and Strive has selected 5 goals and 10 community level indicators, and then they break those indicators down. And again, it's it's the community, the nonprofits themselves. They can decide whether or not they want to adopt them. Clearly they've got their requirements for government funding. But as I said, if they want to participate in the collaborative, then they need to adopt those indicators. And when you have the full weight of all of the major local philanthropic community basically saying, okay, you can do whatever you want, but if you actually want to participate and you want funding from us, you've got to adopt these indicators.
Steve?
I understand why, if you were the 201st organization to come in and the other 200 were doing something, why you would feel compelled to participate and why there'd be pressure. How do you get the dialogue going so that, when everybody is running 200 different programs with 9 different metrics, how do you talk to those people to get them to agree that this is a good idea?
Yeah, that happens in different ways in different communities. I think it's generally been, from the university. I mean, Strive was initiated by university, the Community Foundation, United Way, a couple of the key leaders, a local foundation called KnowledgeWorks that actually incubated Strive within it. So you need some leaders in the community to come together. I think it's been different in every community. It typically folks that are, either in education, workforce development, or economic development who are leaders and have some success in collaboration and see the vision are the ones that pull it together. I know Norm is involved in a Cradle to Career initiative in Seattle, and I don't know if you want to talk about how that came together.
Essentially what we did is when there was the Promised Neighborhoods, we got a lot of organizations together to begin to think about how they would apply for it. As they began to apply for it, we felt we need to have a common language, and we started talking about human capital. How do we develop human capital from cradle to career? And then we got us all talking the same way with the same aspirational goal, and it began to move. We funded it, the foundation, and then Gates Foundation funded it, and we started then getting other participants who were applicants who created that kind of synergy, and it's been growing and growing and growing.
I think that's pretty typical.
Yeah.
Maurice?
This question is more centered around the residents' participation in all this, and partly based on, historically we've had this country has a huge history of large-scale change and
Right.
impacts poverty at school and how the kids do, whether it was the Irish on the docks in Boston or African Americans that built Tulsa and Harlem and stuff. And so I'm wondering that those characteristics you named actually were perfect. Common agenda, trust, all of those pieces I think were really true, and we're trying to do that with organizations. Those are things that keep communities going, that sense of community.
Right.
So I'm wondering, in the initiatives that you've seen, what is the role of the residents, the families,
Yeah.
the parents and stuff?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think, I think the answer is it varies, but I think in general the people that are doing this work all agree that it's absolutely necessary to get the residents involved. And some collaboratives that have these conditions have done that better than others. One that I might point to that I think has been really successful is actually in a rural community, Southwood County, Wisconsin. They're actually a Social Innovation Fund winner. And, it's a sort of classic, company was a company town with a paper and pulp manufacturer who moved out, and that's basically who employed most people. I think there are 35,000 people in the town. And they've got to transition to the new economy. And their sort of work around what really amounts to is more broader workforce development, but clearly 18 to 24 is a major part of that, is really trying to bring in sort of adaptive leadership skills and training the residents and spending time sort of giving people the skills, the sort of stuff that Paul's organizations does to actually, affect change and participate in the dialogue. So, I think there are a lot of different ways. I know we're working in Seattle with Norm's initiative, and there's been a major effort there to engage residents up front. The answers aren't known yet, in terms of how they're going to define success. They're sharing data with residents and sort of asking what their ideas are. you know, a lot of different forums to sort of get the information up front. So they're actually working at, you know, sort of at a community level. They're working with, you know, the CEOs of the organizations, but they're also working at the sort of grass tops and grassroots as well. You've got to work at all those levels. And I think, again, you look at a lot of these initiatives, and some have been more effective at engaging at that resident level than others. But I haven't talked to anybody who doesn't think that's not important.
John? And then Bill.
Just out of curiosity, in the case of Cincinnati, Strive is both service provider and broker. Is that fair?
No.
They're not service
They're not a
providers.
service provider. Not at all. No, they're just, you can think about basically for a backbone organization, 3 basic capabilities that are required. One is sort of, you know, what I'll call strategic coherence of the initiative or project management. The second is process facilitator of the groups when they get together. And the third is the data measurement and collection. So they are not a service provider. And you look at it, it's sort of interesting. I mean, they've got an annual budget of $1.5 million, and they're coordinating organizations collectively that have $7 billion in revenue. And we talk a lot about budgets decreasing, and we all have to be sensitive to that. What's interesting is they're making progress without any additional resources going into the community. Why? Because they're more effectively using the resources that they have.
John?
I think that addressed my question. So, John, first of all, I thought this was really clearly both written and spoken.
Thank you.
We were college classmates, so he had an outstanding education, I can assure you. And as I'm thinking about how this can apply to youth pathways, your model apply to youth pathways, the common purpose makes sense. Shared measurement systems, which Byron will have done by the time he reads out the
Next week,
effectiveness
right?
committee.
No, actually, the half 45
in a minute, the continuous communication, but this backbone support.
Yeah.
Are you saying that given that the solution's going to have to cut across education and career and the social and financial responsibility, that in addition to making, we're going to have to build, there's going to have to be some sort of integrative support organization that's built over and above the, what did you call them, the service providers?
Yeah.
Or broker.
For it to really stay cohesive, or?
Right, so it's a really good question. Do you need a new organization to do this, or is it an existing organization, and can it be a service provider? And I think the answer is it's varied by community. I think it does need somebody who needs to be an organization that's perceived as neutral and is more of a process facilitator than a deliverer, so unlikely to be a service provider. In a number of different communities, community foundations and United Ways are pretty well positioned. They're variable across the country in terms of their capacity and their capability, but you've got some superb leaders out there with both community foundations and United Ways, and they're used to working cross-sector, and they're at the center of a lot of the, you know, collaborations already in workforce development and economic development and education. They're already there. So I think they're good. If you're going to pick an existing organization, you know, those are 2 good organizations to pick. In this area, you might also think about you know, the local workforce investment boards. In some communities that might make sense. They tend to have a, you know, different mission a bit than what your mission is. But I think, you know, you sort of got to look. The bottom line is it's got to be sort of a neutral organization and not a service provider. And in many instances, it might be new, but certainly there's capacity, and we're seeing community foundations and United Ways play this role.
Diana, then Michael, and then Scott.
John, a few things. Firstly, on the most recent point you just made about the community foundation and United Way, I would like to suggest, especially if this is going to be an initiative that goes into many cities, that maybe another way to look at it is to see who the neutral leaders are, or the ones with the broadest, deepest respect. Sometimes it could be a YMCA local, sometimes it's a religious organization, so I wouldn't want it to be limited to be seen only through the prism of those 2, especially for those who don't know this field. The second thing is, I've been involved in activities in which the large-scale kind of change you're talking about could easily be reflected in the 5 elements you said. I would add one, and then I want to raise a question, and that is that what I saw in those successful efforts is that it also included that the key players around the table each brought distinctively different sets of assets or skills,
right,
so that the value added was cumulative and not competitive.
Right.
And that in that there was an inherent respect across the board about that I can't do this without you because you bring distinctive separate skills or separate assets that enhance this collective effort. The second point, though, that leads me actually also to raise a question. What we also found is that there was always a core group who drove the effort, even if there was one anchor institution, which meant that others were excluded. And as the effort, at least being in the inner circle, and as the effort gained momentum and went far beyond the efforts, where the momentum was exactly the kind of change one wanted, others wanted in and wanted in at the table. And that the successful groups were sometimes rather effective ones with more assets, more capabilities, more political connections, and that raised questions of the politics of inclusion. In the kinds of things we're talking about now, how do we make sure from the ground up that the people who aren't necessarily part of the initial momentum aren't excluded and therefore doom this to fail? And the second one is, with all of these kinds of efforts that I've seen, the sustainability over a long period of time was questionable. Once the goals were achieved, that effort seemed to dissipate. How do you make sure this is ongoing and sustained?
Well, you cover a lot of ground there. Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you. I mentioned Community Foundations United Ways, but I think your criteria are the right criteria, which are who are the trusted individuals and organizations within the community who have relationships and are the honest brokers. So I think that's going to vary by community, and so I don't think you can sort of typology this and sort of say it's this type of organization. It really is. It's dependent on how the organization practices. The issue of inclusion, I think, is a really important one. You know, I think it's related to the issue of getting residents involved, and I think there's always the challenge of pace of the effort. Proceeding with all deliberate haste and inclusion, because inclusion slows you down. And so that's always a balancing act. I think it's, that's partly why you need to have the right people leading the effort who can show the good judgment to do that. And I think, for this council to make that part of the value set of how you think about encouraging this work, I think would be wonderful.
Great. It is next to Michael.
My turn. I have two quick questions. One, I thought this was terrific. Thank you very much. Particularly for someone like me who dabbles in this world but doesn't come from this world, it was a very brief but intense and terrific education. Thank you. The two questions I have. I live more in the corporate world, and we talked about misalignment of dollars and resources. There are many. There are thousands, of corporations who believe they're doing the right thing. They're out there doing the right thing and spending lots of dollars. But they are the ultimate sort of isolated impact. And so we talked earlier about sort of misallocation of federal, state, and local dollars. How do we begin to think about how to give corporations a better path so they're not dealing in an isolated impact? That's one thing. And then the second question I have is serving on not-for-profit boards myself, as much as everybody wants to work together, there is this natural competition for both dollars and sort of prestige. So how do you deal with the dollar competition among when you're working together as a unit? So those are my two issues. Common purpose when you've all got your dollar priorities, and then how do you align corporate giving in a way that's not going to be isolated impact?
Right. Those are great questions. On the corporate side, there's an evolution in the field of corporate philanthropy and corporations' engagement with society to invest in society in ways that are relevant to the business. And so I think that's one aspect. But the second aspect I'll focus on with corporations, and back to what I said this morning, I think the real opportunity here is you have to link this into economic development. And Kristen, you mentioned this morning, how do we tie in, entrepreneurs? And, the fact of the matter is there are certain, industry clusters that are more effective and more prosperous in certain areas of the country than others. So we talk about healthcare in Boston or Houston, or we talk about hospitality in New Orleans. And I think, if you look at economic development efforts, the smart communities have said, okay, what are we going to try to be good at? I'm working right now in Battle Creek, and they've got a really exciting initiative. Post and Kellogg's are located there, and they're focusing economic development on food science. And they're thinking about what they can do both in terms of large corporations and also incubating businesses, right? So I think that's a real opportunity to tie in corporations and also bring in the community level engagement, because it's different in different communities in terms of what you're going to look for. The second thing in terms of dollars and sort of prestige and nonprofits, et cetera, this is where the continuous communication, this doesn't sort of happen probably at the first meeting, that you get this level of alignment. This happens over time. That's why we need that sort of frequent communication. And people what happens over time, what we've observed, is that these are mission-driven organizations, and at the end of the day, if they agree to a common agenda, they will sort out over time what they're really good at. Diane, one of the other comments you made is that if everybody's bringing different assets, that's great. We know that's not ideal. I can guarantee in this community that had 270 youth development organizations that there's overlap, and that some people will have to make choices. And you don't get that until you actually get this dialogue and orient it around common outcomes.
Great. Scott, Mr. Patience Cowan.
John, thinking about Cincinnati for a minute, it seems there was some preconditions that was evident in Cincinnati that enabled this to happen.
Yeah.
And that is they have breadth and depth of intellectual financial assets.
Right.
Fortune 500 companies, large foundations,
right.
Universities. What happens when you don't live in a community that has the breadth and depth of these assets?
Yeah.
Especially the financial assets.
Right.
I mean, have you seen the collective impact in a community where they did not have those preconditions in place, especially the financial assets?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. I think, it's probably not a surprise that Strive happened in Cincinnati. I think, frankly, mid-sized communities are the easiest place for this sort of stuff to happen because you've got resources, but people know each other. You sort of got manageable scale. You talk to folks in rural communities, and they will say, okay, we don't have economies of scale, but we have manageable scale. So they do look at it that same way. Now, they probably do have less resources. So, that's what I've seen in, you've got more clever folks in rural communities like Southwood County that have been really great at basically accessing more, government funding. Through sort of demonstrating, their effectiveness. So I think, it's there clearly is, the issue of resources. The thing I'll say too is that the real opportunity here for this stuff to happen is that funders need to say, okay, the investment that's probably going to go into a backbone organization, getting these organizations together on a regular basis, maybe even shared metrics, probably shouldn't and isn't going to come from government. It should, private philanthropy is probably the best source, but it's one of the greatest leverage points that private philanthropy can have. Back to Strive, $1.5 million budget, $700 billion that they're actually coordinating. I think we're seeing this in rural communities, the ones who are creative. The other thing I'll say, I want to make this point before we break, the conversation this morning is, are people, do we have to hoist this on people or not? My sense is there's a lot of pent-up demand for this. Strive just had their national conference. They just actually called the convening of communities that were considering or actually doing Cradle to Career. They had 30 different communities show up. Nobody paid them to show up. Nobody, they just came because they want to do it. I think people in communities, they get this collaborative stuff. They're doing it around workforce, education, and economic development. And there's a lot of relationships built up. I think you can move more quickly in building a platform for this than maybe people might think.
Great. Maurice, do you have a new question, or is that from the old one?
Well, it's a new one.
It's a new one. Great. So what I'm going to suggest is, Maurice and Jim, that you each ask your questions, and then we'll have John respond to both, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, it's a little bit of a different subject. It's actually going back to Mike's question about who to fund. And one of the things that's coming up on the foundation board is that we're looking at the issue of consumer voice. And for middle and upper income, the way services come to us is really demand driven. It's that businesses are constantly surveying me and trying to figure out what works for me, what doesn't work for me. And that's what kind of clears the marketplace, and that's what makes it more effective for me and my kids to kind of get our lives together. And what's happening right now in some of the discussions is this issue of consumer voice that if we were able to get the consumer voice, it could help us make, as funders and as government, could make us make better decisions as to what's working and not working at the grassroots level. And I'm just wondering if you've run into, really trying to get some assessment from that consumer voice piece in any of the initiatives you're looking at.
Great. Make a note of that. And Jim?
In part, I'm coming back to Diana's question, but the article presumes that there are these 5 ingredients because you have a collective that is now engaged in a set of activities, and this is what makes that collective successful. Diana had asked a question about sort of inclusion-exclusion, and I'm wondering if there's anything in the work that you did about who should be part of that collective, or how it is there are certain ways that that collective gets built that leads to success or that perhaps doesn't lead to success.
Yeah, Jim, that's a really great question, and it's an area that we need to explore further. It's a very nuanced area, and I think the answer there's not going to be a recipe. I think it is going to vary by community. That said, I think there's better understanding that we can get that this council might be able to communicate to think about this issue of conclusion and pace. We haven't actually been able to get deeply into that. That's definitely an area that we want to look at more. So I appreciate your asking that question.
And then to Maurice's.
Oh, on the consumer voice thing.
John? He asked a question about the consumer voice.
What's that?
He asked a question about the consumer voice.
Oh, consumer voice. Yeah. That's a good one. I mean, it's an interesting framing, and in terms of, again, I sort of connect that with being much more connected with the residents in these efforts, and I don't know that I have any great examples of that that I've seen yet, but I think
it's still very new. I think.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I just want to wrap up with a couple comments. One is that what I know from talking to these folks, it takes a long time to build the trust. So it's not that they brought these leaders together and whammo, in a year they had a plan. It took 3 years for some of the stakeholders to just come to the table. And there was a lot of trust building. And another story that I found interesting was just the fact that I asked, how do they deal with the most powerful nonprofit in the community? And the challenge, and it was a big challenge, because its board members did not want to cede its power, authority, prestige, resources, but they were able to create a space in which they got the money people at the table to drop the pet projects and create a real sense of equality there and to hold people accountable to the common goals. So it's not, you can have your annual report and they would look and say, great, show us your data and how it relates to what we're doing and show us how you're meeting all these metrics. And I wanted to close with how things work now, which isn't too different than it was 15 years ago when I read this book by Forsaking Our Children, in which this guy who was trying to reform a social welfare bureaucracy told a story where he found 40 youth workers, caseworkers, and social workers that were serving the same poor family. And he decided to bring them all together. And then he invited the mother, and he interviewed the mother. And none of you will be surprised, probably, that what she said her great needs were, none of them were meeting. They were all meeting outcomes. They were all meeting great little isolated impacts in the family's life. But the family had no electricity for 2 months. And he said, who's going to help her get her lights turned on? And everyone stood there blank-faced. And he went through a series of other questions. And I say that to say that's how it works now. The average, and John McKnight has a famous quote, takes one poor neighborhood to support 2 middle-class neighborhoods. And that's kind of how it works now. And I think we have to think about how do we actually create an impact that moves past that.
Can I just make a comment on that? Because again, we've been studying the innovation literature.
Yep.
And one of the really interesting things, and it comes back to the voice of the recipient, is often we all rush in with the solution because we all have a view about what the right solution is. And a lot of the innovation literature is that you have to step back and involve the stakeholders, particularly the recipients, in what the problem is. And that all the intervention folks don't do that because everybody has their own model and their own theory of change and whatever. And that often bringing the kids in, or the families, or whatever, you get a very different view and a more commonly grounded view about what the problem is. And that can be the platform on which working together on more shared resources towards solutions could really be grounded. So as we're experimenting or recommending, there's some very good cases that we've been very compelled by on just that issue.
This was a fabulous discussion. I think that Judith brings us back to using the lens we agreed we would look through. Start with grounded in the needs of families and youth, common agenda, shared measurement system, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone organization. But through this lens of what does the community need, but especially what do the youth need to successfully attach to the careers and lives that they aspire to. And if you put those two together, it was interesting that was one place where you held back just a little bit, and that these were great community connectors, but it wasn't completely as clear that we have a standout for connection to the ultimate recipients. And now partially they were talking K-12, so it's a little harder to connect to the third grader and say, what does he or she need? But there are families that serve that proxy.
Right.
But there weren't success networks that were specifically identified around connecting this to what the family needs.
Yeah, I think, we've seen one of the examples we talked about in the article, the environment, actually came out of the residents' watershed restoration issue. So I think again, there are multiple models here, and I think it really should be, well, my opinion, a value of this council to think about inclusion.
Good. Well, thank you to John, huh? Thank you. Just about an hour and 15 minutes left, and our primary objective is to understand where the work groups believe they're taking us in terms of sharpening our sense of our objectives and potential for plans, and of course, how are we going to get the work done. So I'm going to turn now, and I think we should have Byron kick it off, because I think we all came back to, time and again, this idea of identifying what is needed for us to be effective and for these changes to be effective. So maybe we could start with the playback from the effectiveness group.
Okay.
And I do think we need the flip charts in here for sure.
They're right here.
Oh, never mind. We have the flip charts in here.
Okay. So the three things I want to talk about from the effectiveness group is, one, Patty asked, we have for our council as a whole, our vision and mission that we've laid out there, and sort of would there be a level of goal, below vision and mission that we would look at. We talked about that. We didn't come up with an exact wording. I tried to synthesize what I think the spirit of the conversation was into a wording to talk about. Second thing would be the deliverables of the effectiveness team, kind of over time, what we expect to deliver to this group. And then the third would be a little bit of what we're going to need from the other two work groups, and roughly when. So obviously there's a lot more to do to sharpen it, but just as a first cut.
Is somebody being a scribe, or is going to take a unified note?
She's going to try that, and we outline what we have.
And I've got notes too, so for this part, I will definitely make sure that.
Good.
Great. Exactly. Okay, so I'm going to sort of give you a sentence on this goal, and just as you listen, every time you hear a number, understand that we can change that number. So let's listen for, is this the kind of right form of the answer? Because a few months from now, we're going to know much more about which numbers make sense. All right, so the goal for this council that we would sort of hold ourselves to are catalyze changes and place the spotlight on initiatives that can connect 1 million or more disconnected youth to employment and educational pathways by 2020, with 50+ communities leading the way.
Say one more time.
All right. That our goal as a council would be to catalyze changes and place the spotlight on initiatives that connect 1 million or more disconnected youth to employment and educational pathways by 2020, with 50-plus communities leading the way.
Now, are you suggesting those are the actual words, or that's the concept?
That's the, well, of course it's the concept. I mean, any of the words can be changed. I wouldn't probably spend the time editing the words in this group if we agree with the concept.
Are these
Yes.
are these the elements of the package we want for our goal?
And I think we talked about the numbers, and our feeling was that putting some stake in the ground initially to sort of stretch us to really kind of try to come up with something more transformative. If we include in our work that that goal is too ambitious or not ambitious enough, and we can obviously change that. That we wanted to put something of a stake in the ground for the whole group.
People?
Any reactions to that?
Diana?
Byron, I love what's there. What's missing for me is the what. So it's an initiative about what. That could be a substitute for practically any subject, and I'm wondering what your thinking was on not having what this is about. It's 1 million youth to do with what?
Sorry, to connect 1 million or more disconnected youth to employment and educational pathways. Yeah, by 2020, with 50-plus communities leading the way. So yes, definitely. There was a real emphasis on employment and then on educational pathways that lead to employment. So not education per se, but that's obviously an important part of it.
John?
I love it. I think it's stunning. Let me say that for the record. But do you also envision taking the goal seriously in terms of by 2020, seeing where the young people are now that are going to be getting the employment or the multiple pathway to work, and then creating benchmarks or indicators of effectiveness, much as Strive did in Cincinnati?
Yes. So that's the whole second part of what I want to talk about is sort of what we consider the deliverables of the effectiveness team as our contribution towards that.
I just want to sit for 1 second with this goal, because like we said, we can put wordsmiths against it after this, but does it represent what we are trying to do, that stretch of 1,050,000 communities that do it well, needle movers in 50 communities, to use Paul's thinking about it, to employment and educational pathways. 1 million moved from one side to the other. People, I need nods, I need something here.
That's 20,000 per community on average.
Yeah.
Byron, one concern I have, I mean, I applaud the goal, is by stating it that way, are we defining it almost as an urban problem? And therefore excluding solutions that may apply to rural areas?
So that was definitely not the intent. And the idea, and it actually doesn't say 1 million in 50 communities. It says 1 million for the country with 50 communities leading the way, or 50-plus communities leading the way. So it's meant to be, it's meant to be things that can be applied.
I understand, but basically, I don't know, I'm looking around the room, I may be the person from the most rural community. I don't really come from a rural community and grew up in the Bronx, but it strikes me that if you set that agenda and we put programs in place along those lines, although you are not purposely excluding anybody, programmatically in the direction you head, they may get left behind.
So no,
why wouldn't some of the 50 communities be rural?
I was going to say, let's presume we have some parens, okay,
Yeah.
that might not make it to the top of the chart.
That's fine. I just want to make the point.
But the paren is representing a range of
Good.
communities. I hate to use say diverse, because then people, but a range of American communities. I think it's a very good point.
And I think the reason community was in there, and I learned a lot from our discussion, was if 1 million's a top-down goal, the unit of change will be the community.
Right.
That's right.
That's where the unit of action will be, not top-down. And so I think that
first-
was the intent,
Exactly.
to say it'll be community-based change that adds up to.
So the First Lady put it well, that she thought we needed bold goals and bottoms up, and there's a
Yes.
tension between those two, and we're trying to
And
reconcile with
communities
this
embedded
goal.
in the statement to signify the bottoms up, I think.
There are two
Bill.
dimensions. I like the goal, then we can talk about the strategy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right now,
I
we're just
agree.
doing goals, just doing goal. Mark?
Regarding that, then, if I like it, I guess the question for me, by 2020, is 50 aspirational enough? If it will include rural and urban in the United States of America by 2020?
Well, and just again, what we're trying to get to there is not 50 communities by 2020. It says 50 plus communities leading the way. So what we'd actually like to see is, as soon as possible, to have 50 communities up and running. If we're going to be really aspirational, we'd want to say, by the time we finished our work 2 years from now, that 50 communities would be tangibly engaged in this, already working. So it's not to say you get to 50 by 2020, it's to say those 50 are leading the way. You'd want to see it, if you get to 1 million, you'd want to see this across the country by 2020.
It's the unstoppable momentum number. And do remember at the beginning, he said put XX where every number is,
Right.
because over the next few weeks, we can fill those numbers in as we get
Change
more
the
set.
dates, we can change the number of communities, et cetera.
Michael and then Paula.
You know, I mean, one, I like it. I want to wordsmith it, but I like the idea very much. And, you know, I keep going back to the State of the Union, you know, where the president says, you know, we do big things. And I think that our mission, I think, is to follow that mission, and that is to do some big things. And again, I think that I would not want to get too caught up in, and I wish we could accomplish it in 2 years, but again, I wouldn't want to get caught up in exactly what we can accomplish in 2 years. It's more about what lives on beyond this and how we can look at this 10 years from now and look back at the work we did and said we started this momentum going that actually created this impact. The other thing, though, I think, which is critically important, though, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, is that if we're going to make this statement, then we're going to have to be able to answer in fairly tangible ways the how.
So the deliverables are his next
No, I'm saying,
item.
I'm not saying, or it's pretty common, you know, so
Paula and then we'll let him move to, because he's actually got some process for
Right.
deliverables too, but let's let Paula do one.
I think it's a very powerful how and what. What I'm not entirely convinced of is, and maybe it is self-evident, the why. If you're not one of these 50 communities, if you're somewhere else, what's in it for me? And I do have a bit of a concern that, short of taking one of the president's statements like, you know, this is a competitiveness issue or something like that, then we lose the opportunity to really define the why in a way that leads everyone, potentially, in the United States to say, I'm part of this.
So you want to connect it to the narrative of what the nation needs or what
we,
Exactly.
we do consider that part of our
That's right.
deliverables.
The why. The why.
Okay, very good,
Yeah.
very good. So if we can park that for a minute, let's move to the deliverables of the effectiveness group.
Well, we're not actually parking it. We're actually handing it over officially to the communications. There
you go, Michael.
Work is done. Check. Effectiveness over to the communications. And then
Now
you come back.
Our job is to delegate and hold the other groups
Done.
accountable. That's what we decided.
Paul, that's true of everybody.
So, second part of this, our deliverables of the effectiveness team, and let's break it up into 3 time frames because we have a clearer view of what we're doing between now and June. We have some ideas about beyond that, and we'll give you a sense of those and would love your feedback. So between February and June, 3 things. First, getting at the goals and metrics. That is to say, the outcomes for young people that we seek, the return on investment, and the scale of the impact. Those dimensions against what will be a simple, workable, usable segmentation of these disconnected youth. Because we believe that actually if you're trying to assess the return on investment of a program, the appropriate metrics to judge it by, it definitely depends on the segment of youth that you're working with. And so there's some real work to be done. It's got to be simple, it's got to be workable, but we have to, that's sort of a set of analyses that we want to, and that will be a big, we'll feed that into the programs team, we hope, to help guide the work of the programs team. Then the second is, it relates to your question, Paula, about the why, is the business case for all the major stakeholders, specifically for a community, you know, perhaps for different communities, rural, you know, urban. We'll have to look at that. What is the cost of this problem and what is the value of solving it for the community. For the taxpayer, when you look at all the costs, fiscal costs of the problems associated with this, what are those costs? What are the values of solving it? Again, that creates a framework against which the return on investment can be assessed. And then for employers, so we think this is quite important. On the pre-work that Michelle showed us, we saw employers in the private sector as having a very high potential for impact here, but quite low sort of impact thus far in terms of any sort of systematic models. We think one of the reasons is that there's not a clear business case or return on investment analysis for businesses, for employers, and that we think that's an important piece that's to be done. And then for the country, if you roll that up, but that business case that addresses the why, but we think it also lays a very important foundation for what could plausibly scale, right? Because you have to have those sorts of investment. And then the third deliverable for us will be then a much more detailed action plan for the following 18 months of work, although we have some ideas about that right now.
I let myself go first.
Okay, well no, that's just through June. And just to give you a sense of what we're doing, what we think we're doing afterwards, sort of then the second half of this year, to translate those goals and metrics into a community-based model. So we talked about the shared, shared goals and measurements at the community level. So helping to translate that from the kind of the national to how could a community of it use sort of a package. And maybe, John, that's already out there. We certainly hope so, because we're not planning to make it up from scratch. But having that, then a bit further on an opportunity assessment for these employers and businesses, things like where are the opportunities, the gaps around certification programs and so forth. And then we think we want to contribute, although this will clearly have to come from all three of the working groups, to by December of 2011, an opportunity to use presidential voice and leadership in the run-up to the State of the Union, perhaps in the State of the Union, for some interim announcements, perhaps partnered with philanthropy. We talked about the model of the Promised Neighborhoods competition, something to actually mobilize communities to start acting on this, so that we start to get action and engagement and focus on the ground, by the end of this year rather than at the end of our 2-year tenure. Obviously, that's something we think we have some things to contribute to. The other groups clearly do as well. And then in the first half of 2012, that's when the focus will shift mainly to these policy recommendations around scaling what works. By that time, we expect to have a lot of input from the program team. So policies like the Race to the Top idea, practices like these collective impact community playbooks or industry certification initiatives. And then we expect that there will be work to continue to support the ongoing engagement with communities around the country. So that's it. And then the final thing that I want to be clear about, we'll know more as we go deeper, but what we need from the communications team and what we need from the programs team. So from the communications team, we need to know in a sense what's the storyline that you're trying to put together, and therefore what are the facts and analyses that you need or frameworks that you need from us. I think if you're looking for examples, that goes to the programs team. We're not going to be looking at individual cases, but what we can do is the sort of the facts, the ROI, the why. But it would be really helpful to know if you've got a story you're trying to tell, to understand how we can help you fill that in. And
Larry, can I just interrupt you just on that? One point Michelle made that maybe it's evident to everyone else, I hadn't thought of it. If one of the assets as a commission we have is the president in the bully pulpit, 2 years from now when this commission ends, it'll be smack in the election. And the year leading up to that is probably a hard time for things to come out in non-political ways, so that the window of opportunity to really hit communication before you hit election times a year from now.
Right.
Halfway through the commission, not 2 years. So I thought that was a really interesting, it changes, at least changes my mindset and orientation about time frame about when we really have to go bright and use the asset of the bully pulpit.
Correct. And then the final thing is from the programs team. I mean, it may be obvious, but we are really looking to the programs team for the what works, both in terms of program effectiveness and cost effectiveness and what's real, and then the barriers that you see to these effective programs growing.
So you guys are the insight, we're the numbers, and they're the words. Basically, you guys got to figure it out. We'll put numbers on it. You guys communicate. That's right. Just figure it out, will you? We'll put numbers on it. They can put words on it. We're waiting for you.
So I have one question, and then we should move to the next group, and then we'll come back to all of this. But let me just ask you, how are you going to resource this? Because all of the groups said, all of the groups went away with the reality of our opportunities and our limits. So what was the thinking, or do you still have thinking to do to figure out how to resource it? And does anybody around here?
So there's a lot of thinking to do still on how to resource it. Is the short answer. We did as we went through it. We thought about areas where a lot of work had already been done, and we feel like these areas are places where, we definitely are not starting from scratch. There's a lot of work. So, 4 or 5 weeks into it, we'll have a better idea of what the big gaps are. But also with some of these initiatives, for example, I think there was a sense that, pulling together a combination of private and corporate philanthropy to do something along the lines of Promise Neighborhoods, that might be an achievable thing. We think it's doable, but
And in the 12 weeks ahead, we will either nail resources or trim our sails.
Right. I think there's a realization that there isn't any government money, so we've got to come up with it elsewhere.
Yes, we have.
Well, there's a lot of government money, but it's in programs.
It would have to be repurposed.
Repurposed is the word.
Very good. With that, I think it makes sense to move to the programs group and do communications as the cleanup. Does that make sense? Yeah. Not cleanup, in the best possible way. So, Jim?
And if I departed from my script.
You have a teacher's pad. You have a teacher's pad.
All right. That's good? Can you all see this?
Yes.
All right. So, first of all, I thought the goal sounded perfect, and I think our work in many ways aligns with it, all except for you're looking for the program group to do your job. So we fixed that by changing our name from the program group to the Catalyst Initiative Group, or initiative. We thought program actually implied way too much, the silver bullet program at the local level. And I think our earlier discussion really led us to it really is about that connectedness platform and bringing everything together. So Patty would like to change our name.
And Jim, you're seeing a lot of nods around the room. Everyone's, there's a certain concurrence that your wisdom is right on.
So, and whether or not Catalyst Initiative might be a mouthful, but I do think the word catalyst seemed to jump out at us as it did the effectiveness group. So let me start with the long-term goal that we thought made sense from an initiative perspective, and that is to have a community-led, community-owned, to answer Nancy's early question, sustainable connectedness initiative that really pulls it together for youth to find success in both education and employment. Again, I think pretty aligned with the effectiveness goal. But that's our big picture goal. And this council serves as a catalyst for that success. If we take it to the next flip chart, we really thought it was important to get ourselves grounded in a set of principles on how we would operate, how we would behave. We think this is reflective of the conversation that we had. But it starts with being community-driven, being youth-involved, youth-involved in the solution, having mechanisms to ensure that that takes place. To leverage resources. There's elements of leveraging resource both within the community and conversations we've had about how do federal resources flow into the picture and really serve as a catalyst for success, because the federal government doesn't solve, all of this. We talked about not being prescriptive, but how can the federal flow as a catalyst and be leveraged appropriately in communities. Sustainability and scalability, both out of technology and those best practices, or that DNA of those programs that work at the community level. How do we transfer that knowledge? How do we leverage technology? And I think we also talked about technology at a more integral level in terms of a programmatic tool as well. And then shared accountability, the importance of kind of who owns this. We think it's important, community, it's really a community ownership initiative. If it's not important to the local community, we'll have no impact. But it's also ownership for what we're responsible for, and what the individual is responsible for in the equation. How do we have that spelled out in a pretty meaningful way? Short-term goals, really, we defined as really identifying the current initiatives of connectedness that have a positive impact on youth, or connectedness that have a positive impact that could be transferred. But how do we get that knowledge? We're going to look to the effectiveness group for that. We'll find it. No, we'll work together on that. How do we get to that knowledge so that we can frame what we think is the more important short-term step, and that's listening sessions in 3 to 6 communities are the numbers we thought of. But we thought in our group that we'd start with, can we commit to it with the 7 or 8 of us, but then really invite the council for your full engagement. But we thought we wanted to put a stake in the ground, so we had to kind of commit amongst ourselves if we thought we could pull that off. But get those 2 main things done in the short term. If you break it into a timeline, what we think we can accomplish is between now and June to really get some of those great practices identified, have that inform and feed the listening sessions, synthesize the learnings from those listening sessions, and then really frame our June meeting as a meeting that then results in our design and development of really, I guess I'd call it at this point, the platform for community connectedness that really serves as the catalyst for enabling or allowing or empowering communities to come together in a way that they think is important to serve their need, with the shared goal is recognizing that youth need more to be successful in today's environment. So that will be a big meeting. We'll have to do, it seems like just 2 simple initiatives, but we thought that will probably take every ounce of our time that we have to spare. Then lay out that game plan, and over the course of the next, and this is where some of the time frames that Byron laid out and ours, I think in some ways work well together and may disconnect a little bit. But over the course of that next year, really start deploying the plan, monitoring the success of the plan, establishing the objectives, what communities. We didn't pick numbers, but in that first year, is it that 50? Is it 10 to get it going? 3 to get it going in a big way? We'll get that decided at the June meeting and then start rocking with it. And then really start integrating the work of the effectiveness team and the communications team. We all talk about living on a prayer. These meetings going in parallel. Probably, I think we did pretty good. Prayer works. But I think, we probably sometimes got to start integrating this stuff together, and probably some of that will have to start happening even before the June meeting, but I think the heavy lifting will take place after that. And this is the timing of when's the right time, to get the substantive work, really the unstoppable momentum going, and then look in the context of the broader communications thinking. But we laid out, in June of 2012, we should be ready before we were thinking of the clutter of the election to launch the national program, the national initiative, the national hands-on initiative in a big way, a giant, meaningful way. So that's the work we came up with. And let any of my team members add to or take away from.
So feedback or clarifications for Jim and the program group? I get to start. Can we do January 2012?
Well, we worked with the resources we had, boss.